The night sky over the northern frontier was strangely quiet at first, the kind of silence that carried an ominous weight. 4 Israeli army protection posts stood scattered across the rugged terrain, their dim security lights glowing faintly against the dark horizon. The soldiers stationed there were restless, but unaware of what was unfolding far above them. In the distance, faint vibrations touched the air, like the beating of invisible drums. They grew stronger, sharper, more menacing. The sound was not thunder. It was the hum of engines, 13 Iranian fighter jets slicing through the night, invisible to the naked eye yet deadly in their precision. At the first post, a young soldier sat behind a sandbagged barrier, adjusting the strap of his helmet. He glanced up at the sky, uncertain. His radio crackled with static, a dispatcher trying to raise contact, but the message was garbled. The radar system, normally sharp and vigilant, had been jammed. The Israelis suddenly realized they were being watched, tracked by eyes in the sky that they could neither see nor stop. The second post, perched on a hilltop, was quiet except for the rhythmic pacing of its commander. He lit a cigarette, exhaled into the cold air, and looked toward the valley. Something didn't feel right. A low roar grew louder, like a storm tearing across the heavens. His men stiffened, weapons ready, but they had no clear target. All they could hear was the sky itself trembling. Then the first shadow appeared, fast, sleek, and terrifying. One of the Iranian jets descended low enough for its silhouette to be visible against the moonlight. Panic gripped the soldiers. Sirens blared, men shouted orders, but their defensive systems responded too slowly. The first flare of light came when a missile streaked down like a spear of fire, striking near the perimeter wall. The explosion sent dirt and metal fragments flying into the air. Flames erupted, painting the night orange and red. The ground shook as though the earth itself was under assault. The third post tried desperately to communicate with Central Command, but every channel was blocked. They were isolated, blind, and surrounded by the roar of jets circling overhead. The soldiers could feel the power imbalance, 13 jets moving like predators around helpless prey. Each swoop, each turn in the sky, felt deliberate, designed to break their morale before the final strike. At the fourth post, soldiers crouched inside bunkers, clutching their rifles, their hearts pounding. They whispered to one another about survival, about whether help would come, but deep down they knew. The Iranian jets were not here to scare them. They were here to make a point, and the point would be carved in fire and destruction. Another wave of missiles fell, this time striking ammunition storage. The detonation was massive, a fireball exploding upward like a volcano. The shockwave rattled windows miles away. Men were thrown to the ground, some not rising again. The cries of the wounded echoed through the smoke-filled air, a sound that mingled with the continuing thunder of engines overhead. For hours, the assault continued. Not a full bombardment, but a calculated torment. Jets would swoop low, fire warning shots, and pull back, letting the Israelis feel the fragility of their defenses. Each strike brought more flames, more chaos, more despair. By dawn, the 4 posts were no longer functioning units. They were burning skeletons of concrete and steel, littered with debris and silent forms sprawled on the ground, that once guarded the rugged frontier now stood in ruins. Charred sandbags lay torn open, their contents scattered like ash in the wind. Steel barriers bent and twisted under the heat of fire, while smoke coiled into the sky like black serpents. The silence was even heavier than the thunder of the night before, broken only by the distant groans of the wounded. At the first post, the young soldier who had looked up at the sky hours earlier was still alive, but barely. His arm was broken, his uniform scorched, and blood streaked across his face. He crawled through the rubble, searching for water, for anything that might keep him conscious. Around him, his comrades lay still, some buried under collapsed concrete, others scattered in grotesque stillness. He whispered names, desperate to find someone who might answer, but only the wind replied. The second post had fared no better. The commander who once walked the hilltop with a cigarette now lay face down, his body half buried in gravel. His men were scattered across the compound, many motionless, others writhing in pain. The flames from the first strike had consumed much of their barracks, and the acrid stench of burned fabric and fuel lingered in the air. The survivors tried to regroup, dragging the wounded into whatever shelter remained. But shelter meant nothing now. The jets still circled above, reminding them they were never truly safe. By midday, the Iranian fighters had not left. They hovered at high altitude, occasionally swooping low enough to unleash another missile or drop another bomb. It was not the scale of the destruction that broke the soldiers, but the rhythm of it, the slow, relentless pace of strikes that gave hope only to crush it again. Each pause felt like mercy until the roar of engines shattered it once more. At the third post, the radio operator still fought with his machine, trying to cut through the static. His fingers were burned from pulling wires and switching channels, but he would not give up. His commander, however, already knew the truth. Central Command had either been jammed beyond repair, or they were too paralyzed to respond. The four posts were on their own, left as bait in a larger game of intimidation. Still, the radio operator shouted into his headset, his voice cracking. "We are under continuous fire. We need immediate air support." "We are." His words were swallowed by another explosion that tore through the outer wall. The fourth post, which had gone into lockdown at the first strike, was a graveyard of smoke and flame. Soldiers sat with their backs against the bunker walls, rifles clutched tightly, though they had nothing to aim at. One of them, a veteran with scars from past battles, stared blankly at the floor. He had fought enemies before, but this was different. This was not war in the usual sense. It was domination from the sky. They were not fighting opponents face to face. They were prey, hunted by machines too fast, too high, too merciless. By late afternoon, reinforcements from nearby bases attempted to move toward the posts. Convoys of armored vehicles wound their way along dirt roads, but each movement was spotted from above. The Iranian jets dove low, scattering the convoys before they could arrive. Missiles struck the road, tearing open craters that swallowed trucks whole. Reinforcements were forced to retreat, leaving the four posts isolated once more. The men inside realized with horror that no help was coming. The psychological toll deepened with every passing hour. Soldiers who once believed in the invincibility of their defenses now felt stripped bare. Every shadow in the sky made them flinch. Every echo of thunder made them duck for cover. Fear was no longer just a response, it was their constant companion. When night fell again, the jets launched their most punishing wave. Precision-guided bombs tore through what little structure remained. The first post crumbled into dust. The second was swallowed in flames so bright they turned the night into day. The third post's radio tower collapsed in a storm of sparks. The fourth post's bunker caved in under the shock of repeated blasts, burying those who had taken refuge inside. The ground burned, glowing like molten metal. Fires consumed everything, wood, steel, and flesh alike. The sky above was red with reflections of the inferno below, as if the heavens themselves bore witness to the destruction. For the survivors, there was no longer thought of victory, or even of holding their ground. It was simply about survival. They crawled, limped, and dragged themselves away from the posts, disappearing into the dark valleys, haunted by the images of what they had seen and what they could not stop. The four posts were gone. What had once stood as guardians of the frontier had been reduced to smoldering ruins. And overhead, the 13 Iranian fighter jets vanished into the night, leaving behind silence and fear more devastating than the bombs themselves. The smoldering ruins of the four posts became markers of defeat, visible for miles. Villagers from nearby settlements whispered about the fire on the horizon, their windows glowing red through the night. For them, it was not just another clash in the endless cycle of war. It was a sign that the balance of power had shifted. Word spread quickly, carried by radio chatter, local rumor, and the terrified voices of fleeing soldiers. The survivors staggered into the wilderness, broken in body and spirit. Some dragged the wounded across rocky ground, their boots soaked with dust and blood. Others moved in silence, eyes wide with shock, unable to process the magnitude of what they had endured. A few had lost their weapons in the chaos and now carried nothing but the weight of guilt. They had been defenders once, armed and proud. Now they were shadows. High above, the Iranian jets finally pulled back to their bases. The silence they left behind was not peace, it was emptiness, heavy and suffocating. Fires still burned in the ruins, casting an eerie glow across the shattered landscape. The crackling of collapsing beams and the hiss of smoldering debris were the only sounds. The absence of engines made the silence unbearable. For the soldiers, it was worse than the noise of battle. At dawn, reconnaissance drones from the Israeli side finally ventured into the skies. Their cameras revealed what words could barely describe, for posts obliterated beyond recognition. The command center watching the live feed fell into stunned quiet. Officers exchanged grim looks. Reports were drafted, revised, then locked away. No one wanted to admit the scale of what had happened. To acknowledge it was to admit vulnerability. Meanwhile, among the wreckage, a handful of men remained trapped. They were pinned under collapsed structures, calling faintly for help. Their cries echoed across the rubble, but reached no rescuers. Time became their enemy, each passing hour draining their strength, each rising flame devouring the air they needed to breathe. The Israeli command faced an impossible choice: attempt another rescue mission under skies still controlled by enemy aircraft, or abandon the posts altogether. In secret meetings, the latter was chosen. Official statements spoke vaguely of strategic withdrawals and tactical repositioning. But the soldiers who had fought there knew the truth: there was no strategy in ashes. Across the border, Iranian officials monitored the aftermath with cold precision. The strike had been designed not merely to destroy, but to humiliate, to carve a scar into the psyche of their adversary. The use of 13 jets had been symbolic, an overwhelming show of force, disproportionate, yet deliberate. It was a message, clear and undeniable. Resistance would not be tolerated, and no defense was unbreakable. Back in the ruins, a single Israeli flag still fluttered atop a broken pole at the second post. Its edges were burned, its colors darkened by smoke, but it refused to fall. A group of survivors who stumbled past it paused for a moment, staring. For some, it was a symbol of resilience. For others, a cruel reminder of everything they had lost. The psychological aftermath grew heavier with each passing day. Soldiers who returned to base after escaping the attack spoke little. Some refused to eat. Others woke screaming from nightmares in which the roar of jets never ceased. Commanders tried to rally them with speeches about honor and duty, but the words rang hollow. The men had seen what honor looked like when reduced to fire and rubble. Internationally, whispers turned into headlines. Foreign correspondents pieced together fragments of information from satellite imagery and intercepted communications. Photographs of smoking craters began to circulate online, though official spokesmen denied their authenticity. Analysts debated the implications on late-night broadcasts. Was this the beginning of a larger escalation, or a carefully measured warning shot? The truth, as always, was buried under layers of politics and propaganda. For those who had lived through it, however, there was no ambiguity. The memory of the night was etched into their minds. The scream of missiles, the blinding light of explosions, the unbearable heat of fire licking at their skin. They could still hear the sound of their comrades' voices cut short mid-sentence, could still smell the acrid smoke that clung to their uniforms no matter how much they washed. One survivor, a corporal from the 4th Post, kept a torn notebook in which he scribbled his memories. His handwriting was jagged, frantic. He wrote of the sky turning red, of the bunker collapsing, of crawling through bodies in search of a way out. "I thought I would die with them," he scrawled in one entry. "But the ground opened and let me go. Why me and not them?" His words, raw and unfiltered, captured what official reports never would: the human cost of being hunted from the air. By the end of the week, bulldozers arrived to clear the ruins. Trucks carried away twisted metal and fragments of concrete, but the scars on the land could not be erased. Craters remained, blackened earth carved deep into the soil. The sound of construction could not mask the silence of absence, the absence of the men who had once stood there, the absence of certainty that those posts had ever offered protection. The land remembered, and so did the men.
In the days that followed, the story of the 4 destroyed posts spread like a shadow across military circles. Every soldier knew someone who had been stationed there, and the silence of unanswered calls grew heavier with each passing hour. Mess halls were quieter, barracks more subdued. Conversations stopped when officers walked by, as if speaking about the disaster out loud would give it more power. Yet in the corners of those rooms, the whispers never truly stopped. Everyone knew the truth: 4 protection posts had been erased, and 13 jets had done it with surgical precision. For the families of the soldiers, the silence was unbearable. Mothers and fathers waited by phones that never rang, hoping for news that did not come. Some were told their sons had survived, though no details were given. Others received nothing at all: no message, no letter, only absence. Funerals were delayed, official confirmations withheld. Grief turned into anger, but the answers they demanded were buried under secrecy. Meanwhile, analysts pored over satellite images of the area. The craters left by the strikes were vast, dark wounds in the earth. Each post had been reduced to a smudge of ash and twisted steel. What struck observers most was the precision. Every strike had been deliberate, every impact placed to dismantle defenses in sequence. The radar towers were struck first, then ammunition depots, then living quarters. By the time the final wave fell, the posts were nothing but targets waiting to be erased. Inside military headquarters, the mood was grim. Maps were spread across long tables, red circles drawn where the posts had once stood. Generals argued over the next move. Some demanded immediate retaliation, insisting that anything less would be seen as weakness. Others counseled patience, fearing that escalation would invite an even greater storm. But beneath the surface of those debates lay a deeper truth: the defenses they had believed in, the systems they had trusted, had failed. The survivors carried stories that no official report could sanitize. One described how the night sky looked like it was on fire, as if the heavens themselves had split open. Another spoke of hearing the screams of his comrades drowned out by the roar of engines overhead. A third admitted he had dropped his weapon and run, the shame burning worse than the wounds he carried. Each account was different, yet all were bound by the same thread: helplessness. Beyond the military, the world was watching. News outlets ran grainy footage of explosions lighting up the night, claiming they were from the attacks. Governments issued cautious statements, urging restraint, while secretly calculating the shift in power. In the cafes of distant capitals, ordinary people debated whether this was the spark that would ignite something larger. Some dismissed it as another skirmish in a long line of conflicts. Others sensed that it was different, that the scale, the precision, and the audacity pointed to a dangerous new phase. Back on the ground, the land where the posts once stood grew eerily still. No patrols moved through the valleys. No lights glowed on the hillsides at night. Where once there had been the bustle of soldiers, now there was only silence. The ruins stood like tombstones, blackened and broken, watched over by carrion birds circling overhead. Nature began to reclaim the space, grass pushing through cracked concrete, vines creeping over collapsed walls. Yet the scars of fire remained, reminders of the night the sky had turned hostile. One evening, a small group of survivors returned to the ruins, against orders. They walked slowly among the wreckage, their boots crunching over shattered glass and scorched earth. They did not speak much. Words felt too heavy. One bent down to pick up a fragment of metal, still blackened from heat, and slipped it into his pocket. Another knelt by a crater, whispering a prayer for the men buried beneath. They stayed only a short while, then left before nightfall, as if afraid the jets might return the moment darkness fell. What lingered most for those who had lived through it was not the fire, nor the destruction, but the sound, the roar of engines overhead, constant and inescapable. In their dreams, it returned again and again, louder each time, until they woke drenched in sweat. Some could no longer stand the sight of planes in the sky, even friendly ones. Others grew silent, retreating into themselves, carrying the memory like a weight they could never put down. The condition of the 4 posts after being tracked by 13 fighter jets was not simply destruction. It was a message written in fire across the night sky. It said that strength could be broken, that certainty could be shattered, that even the most fortified positions could fall when hunted from above. It was a story not of buildings destroyed, but of men stripped of their illusions, left to face the reality of power they could not match. And though the fires eventually died, the memory of that night burned on, unquenchable. In the weeks that followed, the memory of the 4 destroyed posts refused to fade. The wreckage had been cleared, the ground leveled, but the scars remained etched into the minds of all who had seen it. Soldiers who had once patrolled those ridges now avoided the area, as if walking there would awaken ghosts. The command referred to the region as under evaluation, yet everyone knew what it really meant: abandoned. For the families of the fallen, closure never came. Some were given sealed coffins draped in flags, but whispers said that not all bodies had been recovered. Others were told their sons were missing in action, a phrase heavy with uncertainty. Mothers lit candles each night, hoping for a miracle, while fathers sat in silence, wrestling with grief too deep for words. At gatherings, the names of the posts were spoken with reverence, like sacred places where blood had been spilled. Among the survivors, silence was the language they shared. They carried invisible wounds that no doctor could heal. In barracks, they sat apart from others, their eyes distant, their hands trembling when sudden noises cracked the air. Some turned to drink, numbing the memories with glass after glass. Others poured their nightmares onto paper, sketching scenes of fire and sky, trying to capture the horror in lines and shapes. A few disappeared altogether, vanishing from duty, unable to return to the places that reminded them of what they had lost. The military tried to reframe the disaster. Speeches were given, medals awarded, phrases like sacrifice and courage repeated until they became hollow. But within the ranks, no one was fooled. They knew the truth. The 4 posts had been outmatched, tracked and dismantled by forces that knew every weakness. The official words rang empty in the face of what they had witnessed with their own eyes. International reaction grew louder. Commentators argued over the symbolism of 13 jets. Some called it overkill, others genius. Military strategists dissected the strikes, admiring the precision even as they condemned the intent. The attacks were studied in academies and briefing rooms, dissected frame by frame. For many, it became a case study of modern warfare, how overwhelming air power could dismantle fortified ground positions without a single soldier stepping across the border.
Yet, for the men who had lived through it, there was no academic detachment. They remembered the sound of comrades screaming under rubble, the blinding flashes that turned night into day, the choking smoke that filled their lungs. They remembered the helplessness most of all, the realization that no matter how hard they fought, they were pawns under a sky owned by someone else. One night, months after the attack, a group of survivors gathered quietly in a small room. They spoke in hushed voices, sharing fragments of their memories. One described how he had crawled through fire, his skin blistering, convinced he would never see daylight again. Another admitted he had heard his friend calling for help but had been too paralyzed to move. A third confessed he still woke at night to the phantom roar of engines. Their stories overlapped, weaving a tapestry of pain and survival that bound them together. Outside, the world moved on. New conflicts erupted, new headlines replaced the old. The 4 posts faded from public attention, reduced to footnotes in reports, their destruction buried under layers of bureaucracy and denial. But for those who had been there, forgetting was impossible. The ruins lived inside them, a constant reminder of fire and fear. For the land itself, time worked slowly. Grass grew over craters, erasing the sharp lines of impact. Wildflowers sprouted where blood had once soaked the soil. Birds returned to the ridges, nesting in the crevices of broken stone. From a distance, it might have seemed as though nothing had happened. But up close, scars still lingered, blackened patches of earth, fragments of metal half buried in dirt, whispers carried by the wind at night. The condition of the 4 Israeli protection posts, after being tracked by 13 Iranian fighter jets, was not simply measured in rubble or fire. It was measured in silence, in the absence of voices that once filled those barracks, in the hollow eyes of survivors, in the fear that lingered long after the skies were empty. The posts were gone, but the story of their fall lived on in every man who had seen it, every family who mourned it, every officer who tried to explain it away. And somewhere, high above in the memory of that night, the sound of 13 engines still roared, carrying with it the reminder that the sky itself could become a weapon, and that no fortress, no matter how strong, was beyond its reach.